Before the turn of the century, the Cyberpunk franchise was a lot smaller. Long before the series reached a whole new level of appeal through its foray into video games, the world of Cyberpunk was constrained to the admittedly niche tabletop demographic, aiming to create an expressive, multifaceted world through collaborative role-playing as a primary vehicle for storytelling. The game's first version, 1998's Cyberpunk, often known as Cyberpunk 2013, named for the year in which it takes place, was considered a relative success and a great proof of concept for its engaging dark future setting, a setting that was expanded upon and refined just 2 years later with the release of the second edition, Cyberpunk 2020. For more than a decade, these two offerings granted players an enticing look into the dangerous, futuristic frontier of Night City, and given the critical and commercial success of Cyberpunk 2020 in particular, as well as its associated supplemental material, players would eagerly await the inevitable announcement of a third mainline installment shortly hereafter. However, leading into 2003, that third expansion, known today as Cyberpunk v3.0 or Cyberpunk 2030X, an edition that sadly wouldn't be all that well received, was at least 2 years from completion. And with no additional game content released for the existing version of the game since the 90s, Cyberpunk had entered a period of relative dormancy. But it was at this time when writer and game designer Peter J. Wax would formulate an idea. A fan of role-playing games, video games, and collectible card games, Wax was someone who saw the potential of the Cyberpunk IP in spite of its waning popularity at the time. Being as it was a franchise that had already achieved success in the tabletop format, he considered the idea of what it would be like to bring Cyberpunk to a new medium of entertainment, one not altogether unfamiliar to the tabletop scene, but distinct nevertheless. Instead of a role-playing game, what if Cyberpunk fans were able to collect and battle with trading cards, in a similar vein to something like Magic the Gathering, which was an IP that Wax had considerable experience with, having participated in championships in and around 1995. It was a compelling idea not just to Wax himself, but also the team at Talsorian Games, and it was from this notion that the official Cyberpunk CCG would be born. Released by Social Games, a trademark of Image Native Worlds Inc., the Cyberpunk CCG was, as its name suggests, a collectible card game. With 2 expansions and hundreds of cards to collect across all versions and products, the game was, in its lead designer's own words, an instant hit. Yet, in spite of both the praise and modern appeal of collectible merchandise from Cyberpunk's early years, few people today seem to remember that the Cyberpunk CCG ever even existed. So, after tracking down some products for myself, I wanted to take a look back at this niche piece of Cyberpunk media together. We'll discuss how it worked, take a look at some of the cards, and I'll give you my thoughts on how the product holds up all these years later. Was it quality? Was it fun? All this and more is soon to come. But first, we have to get a feel for a little bit of the history behind the CCG, particularly relating to its release schedule. In its short but prevalent time on the market, the Cyberpunk CCG was host to 2 separate releases. It included cards relevant to both the 2013 and 2020 versions of the tabletop game, featuring artwork from a number of different creatives. The first edition of the game was released in December of 2003 in a rather limited run. This initial expansion would be known as the 2013 edition, and consisted of the original base set of 305 collectible cards. Months later, in 2004, the second version, also called the 2020 edition, would release as a persistent, unlimited run of the game, and added an additional 61 new cards to collect, while still including all or most of the originals. Like most card games, the Cyberpunk CCG offered booster packs, which were the main way to expand one's collection and increase their options in deck building. But it also brought with it a selection of starter decks, which were sold individually or as a starter deck box, marketed primarily toward retailers. But whereas in most games starter decks are little more than an easy way to get new players interested in the game and give them a way to learn how to play, the Cyberpunk CCG was different in that it kind of required a starter deck to be purchased before the game could be played at all. Let me explain. Each starter deck was themed after one of Cyberpunk's many prominent factions at the time, ranging from corporations to criminal syndicates, with 6 different decks being offered in total. These were the NCPD, the Mob, Biotechnica, the Nomads, Militech, and the Gangs. Each of these decks consisted of a 55-card pre-built deck and an additional 30 random cards that functioned as a sort of shuffle-and-play product, where all of the components needed to enjoy the game and do a bit of deck building were included in one package. Most importantly, however, the starter decks were also the only way to acquire a sponsor card, which acted as a sort of leader or commander and defined a win condition for the deck in question. Each sponsor represented the faction that each particular starter deck was themed after, and was a necessary component of play that was not obtainable from booster packs. In essence, in order to play, you had to obtain a sponsor card, and a sponsor card could only be obtained through these decks. Or alternatively, if you happened to pick up a specific issue of Scry magazine in 2003, you would be given the special Arasaka sponsor card, which is the only card in the game never to release in a traditional product, and is not generally considered a part of that initial run of 305 cards. This means that in total, there were 7 sponsor cards to collect, none of which could be obtained by cracking packs, which, speaking of the pack, let's talk about those next. To obtain most cards, players would turn to the aforementioned booster packs, each of which had 10 cards inside, following a rarity structure that's not all too dissimilar to products like Pokemon or Magic the Gathering. Each booster pack guaranteed 6 common cards, followed by a rare card, and 3 uncommon cards in that order, and unless you happen to pull them from the random 30-card slot in the back of a starter deck, there were a number of cards that were only obtainable in these packs, including several of Cyberpunk's most iconic characters, such as Spider Murphy and Johnny Silverhand, as well as a number of other cards that added depth to a deck and the game itself. Another major difference between the Cyberpunk CCG and other collectible card games is that in Cyberpunk, players each create 2 separate decks to play at the same time. The type of cards that could be added to each deck was dependent on the color of the Cyberpunk logo on the back of the card. Red cards could only be placed into what was called the Runs deck, which would contain runner, location, and operation type cards. Cards with a blue Cyberpunk logo on the back, however, pertained to the Gear deck, which could contain cyber, equipment, and event cards. Both decks must have had a minimum of 42 cards each in order to be played, and it was also prohibited to have more than 4 copies of the same card in either the Runs or Gear decks. Legendary cards, indicated by the legendary tag, were restricted to only 1 copy of that card appearing within the applicable deck as well. Although if you had multiple cards that were different but each had the legendary tagline, you were able to include both so long as there was only 1 copy of each. As is the case with most collectible card games, actually playing the Cyberpunk CCG requires 2 players for a traditional game, and actually creates a fairly complex play environment that's been described by some as a bit convoluted but ultimately fun and enjoyable to partake in. I'm not going to be going through the entirety of the rules within this video, but there will be a PDF of the full version 2.3 rule set linked in the description. The core premise of the game, though, is actually rather simple. You, as the player, essentially adopt the identity of a fixer, representing whatever sponsor card your deck contains. That's the reason they're called a sponsor card, because you're literally representing them and their interests on the battlefield, and preparing to organize and strategize combat against your opponent's sponsored group. And in order to do this, your sponsor will grant you a per-turn allowance of EB, or Eurobucks. To start the game, players would shuffle each of their 2 decks and draw 4 cards in any combination they please from both of the 2. This means that you could choose to draw 2 from each deck, or all 4 from one of them, or 3 and 1 in any way you please, with there being a potential for some pretty strategic drawing right in the beginning of the game, based on whether the Runs or Gear style cards are more applicable to your build. After the players decide among themselves who goes first, they go back and forth following a 6-part turn cycle, starting with the player drawing 3 cards in any way they please. Next, there's an untap step, a step to buy and equip gear, a step to use legwork abilities which appear on certain cards, a step to actually do some attacking, and finally a step to effectively clean up after the battle. The first way to win the game is called an Ops victory. in which you end your turn with at least 100 ops points scored to win. The second is a style victory, which is also accruing 100 of a specific type of point, except this time it's the style point, hence the name. Both ops and style points can be earned by having different types of cards in play. Finally, there's the sponsor victory, which is far and away the most interesting. If you fulfill your sponsor card's unique victory conditions before your opponent, you can also win this way. For example, the victory condition of the NCPD is to get 50 bust points. You gain 1 point each time a cop you control busts an opponent's runner. The sponsor victory condition adds an interesting layer of strategy to the game, offering a unique mechanic depending on the faction you're controlling, and offers a strategy towards victory that's unique to each player. It's certainly an appealing concept from a gameplay perspective. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this video that I picked up some of the products from the game for myself, and although you've been seeing a lot of my own video footage of the cards and whatnot, I haven't talked a whole lot about the physical media itself, or exactly what it is that I got in the first place. To better understand the Cyberpunk CCG in its most authentic form, and to document all of the details of the physical products themselves, I picked up a starter deck box and a full booster box of 40 packs to open up. I also forgot to mention that all the products that I got came from the 2013 edition specifically, so everything you're seeing opened is directly from that version of the game. Despite not having a fantastic recording setup for this type of physical media, I knew that I wanted to document the opening of these products as best I could, because to my knowledge, nobody else has really done so, at least not documentatively. I figured that the starter decks were probably the place to, well, start, and so this would be the first product that I opened. Right away when cracking this thing, seeing the names of each of the factions on the front and top of all 6 individual decks, I feel confident in saying that the aspect of collectability was already working its way into my head. Even though my primary motive for opening these was mostly to create this video and document them so other people can see, I really legitimately found myself excited opening these decks and seeing the blocks of cards inside. Each one also includes a rulebook, which I mentioned earlier. It's a pretty comprehensive explanation of the whole game within a very concise little booklet. Everything in here felt like it had sufficient detail for someone like me who's never played the game before to learn everything there is to know, yet also versatile enough to serve as a sort of on-the-fly reference sheet if there's some kind of ruling needed in the middle of a match. It's also got this really charming little ad on the back, directing players toward free stuff and promotions at cyberpunkccg.com, which, I regret to inform you, is no longer what it was advertised to be, and the domain now belongs to a bunch of bloggers from Texas or something like that. Kinda disappointing, but hopefully whoever these 3 gentlemen are, they're doing well. One thing that I did notice is it's a little bit tough to know where the 55 card deck ends and the 30 bonus cards begin. I had a hard time figuring this out without counting, which was a little bit disappointing, but certainly not deal-breaking. A little cardboard divider maybe in between would have been nice, but I understand they probably also would have had to account for that difference in the size of the deck box, so I mean, it is what it is. Also, another thing that I thought of just now is that the 55 cards are not enough to actually play the game. As I stated previously, you need 2 42 card decks in order to enjoy a game of the Cyberpunk CCG, which means a minimum of 84 cards are required. So you kind of have to take those 30 randomly assorted cards at the back of your deck and incorporate them into your deck in order to actually play. Luckily, after taking a look at a couple of these in person, it seems that both the main 55 cards and the 30 card slot in the back are organized in an alternating blue card, red card pattern, meaning that unless there's some kind of printing error, you should always be guaranteed to have exactly enough cards to shuffle up a deck and start playing, albeit that some of those 30 random cards probably aren't going to lend themselves very well to the deck that you're actually trying to play. I guess it should also be noted that if they truly are random, as they're insinuated to be, there is a non-zero chance of a player receiving more than 4 copies of a given card. Maybe they already have 3 or 4 in the deck, and then there's just 2 more in the random slot or something. Hopefully that's not the case, because that could potentially lead to you not having enough cards to play, which would suck. But in my experience, I don't think that we've had that yet, so I don't know, maybe it was more controlled than I'm making it out to seem. I'm not really sure. I think out of all of the decks that I opened, the one that I was personally drawn to the most was the one themed after the Nomads. They have a really interesting win condition, in which you have to have a certain number of cards in play, consisting of a location, known as the open road, and at least one of each of the vehicle types: motorcycle, hover, truck, RV, AV, helicopter, and car. Even though compared to some of the conditions of other cards, it is a surprisingly specific set of circumstances to actually have occur within a game, I think it's just really cool, and a really fun, albeit overt, nod to the Nomad theming throughout Cyberpunk history. I don't know, maybe I'm crazy, maybe it's actually like the worst deck and I just don't realize it, maybe I'm just too much of a simp for Pan Am, I really don't know, but I thought this one was pretty cool, and I'd love to give it a whirl in an actual game sometime. I personally find the angle of acting as a fixer as a central mechanic being really appealing. I think that's cool. It certainly offers a unique perspective on strategic thinking in the dark future that I find gives the Cyberpunk CCG a very unique and honestly just cool game identity. I can certainly see how this game could be very fun to play, and even though the rules in their entirety can be a little bit difficult to remember or even contradictory at times, they don't seem nearly as overbearing as a game like Magic: The Gathering can be for new players, even given the more unique gameplay aspect of having two separate decks. In fact, I would imagine that in some ways, having a notion of exactly what kind of cards you're going to be drawing at any given time could open up a lot of unique strategy and semblance within a deck that eliminates some of the difficulty of building an effective custom deck as presented in a game like Pokemon or Magic. While the element of randomness is still there, as is the case with all of these games, it seems there's a much more reasonable degree of randomness, and there's certainly some freedom, or even incentive, to really get creative with how you approach the game. All that is to say that I think the strategy element of the Cyberpunk CCG is actually more broad than some of the limited impressions available online might assume. It was clear to me just from my time reading the rulebook and seeing how everything fits together that Peter Wax and the rest of the team at Social Games and Image Native had a lot of passion for the Cyberpunk source material of the day, and translated that passion very effectively to the medium of the card game. There's definitely a quality experience to be had here, and I'm a little bit sad that these cards are now out of print, or that something similar doesn't exist, at least to my knowledge, to serve the modern era of Cyberpunk. I'd really like to see this come back, everything from the deck opening experience to the kind of goofy but in a retro way art of the cards. It's very charming in the same way as something like MetaZoo, and opening the booster packs is just as addictive as any larger card game IP. Now, let it be known once more that all of this product that I opened in the making of this video was from the earliest, more limited run of the Cyberpunk CCG, the 2013 edition, so I can't say that I've seen every card that the game has to offer. In fact, there were some cards that I was looking for when opening the booster packs that I just didn't end up finding at all, like Johnny Silverhand. Although at the time of opening I believed that I'd found nearly everything, I think there's actually a decent amount more that I have left to see, so perhaps in the future, if you guys found this interesting, I'll take some time to revisit the 2020 edition of the card game specifically and crack some of those packs. I do have to admit that I wouldn't be opposed to trying to collect some of the cards exclusive to that version either. I found myself really enjoying the Cyberpunk CCG and have a legitimate interest in collecting each and every card that the game has to offer, both for the purpose of preservation and presentation, but also just for the enjoyment of the hunt. Speaking of that, I also wanted to make it known that I do plan on releasing the full video footage of my opening of the 2013 edition booster box that I picked up. I'm currently in the process of editing that one for time, but that video will probably be appearing on the channel relatively soon, and it's essentially just going to be an unboxing style upload where you'll get to see each and every card that I pulled. I basically want to have that video up just so anyone who might have any kind of interest in the game can see exactly what the opening experience is like. So yeah, while this video was a little bit more of my take on the game and a documentation of its history and how it works, that one's definitely going to be more of a showcase of all of the actual product and that sort of thing. So if that's appealing to you, I hope you'll look forward to seeing it. And although I know it's a bit shorter of an upload today, that pretty much does it for me. I hope that you enjoyed this look at the more obscure side of cyberpunk media. I certainly thought it was a lot of fun and had a great time preparing it. I'm really interested to see what you guys think as well. What are your thoughts on the card game as a whole? Has anyone watching ever actually played it before? And if so, what did you think of the game? I'll let it be known once again for everyone who has an interest in reviewing some of the material relating to the product that I have a full scan of the instructions available available in the description, so you can access or download it or do whatever you please with it. If you liked this video and want to see more content from me, from lore overviews to media analysis like this, and more, then feel free to subscribe to the channel as well. I have a lot of fun videos planned related to all manner of games and media, and I hope you'll stick around to see some of it. I guess that's gonna do it from me though. This is Averberon, I'll see you again soon, and have a good one.